book in the Firm Foundation series, lesson number 29, God Gives Israel a King. Just a reminder that you can download notes for this lesson at my new website, Major Jolt Media. That's where notes for all the Firm Foundation lessons are available, along with my other series, Firm Foundation Bite Size. The same messages, only shorter, just 5 to 12 minutes in length. Also, you'll find my devotional podcast there, which is Where is God When Life Sucks? And my blog, The Brainwashed Pilgrim, along with tons of articles, important prayers that you can download and pray, links to other videos, and so much more. It's all at majorjolt.us. That's all the address you need. Just type in majorjolt.us. It's a roadmap for your soul. Well, up to this point in this series, we've seen where the Israelites were living in the land of Egypt, and the Pharaoh turned them into slaves. They worked long hours making bricks and pulling heavy stone to build the pyramids. And they weren't treated well at all. As God had told Abraham in Genesis 15, the Jews, God's chosen people, they would live as slaves in Egypt for over 400 years. And then we saw where God sent his messenger Moses to Egypt and delivered his people from slavery. And God promised the Israelites that he was going to take them to a land where they would live as his people. And God gave Moses laws for his people to follow. And these laws are known as the Ten Commandments and the Torah, which is God's instruction. And these laws made Israel unique and separate from all their surrounding neighbors. As they kept the Torah and made daily sacrifices in the tabernacle, they were honoring and glorifying God, and it was evident to all the surrounding peoples that the Israelites were special. And what made them special was their God was the ruler and king. Well, now we come to a point in the history of Israel where they want to be like all their neighbors. They want a king that they can see. And God had given them leaders and judges in the past that they could go to for help. And it was God who protected them and provided for them. But now we see that the Israelites are wanting to be like everyone else. They had been set apart by Almighty God to be his special chosen people. And now they're wanting to be average or normal. They want to be like everybody else. And that's what it's like for us as Christians sometimes. We want to so identify with the world around us that we make compromises and we give into temptation and sin and do things that everyone else is doing just so we can fit in. And that's what's going on with Israel at this point. They wanted a king that all the other neighboring tribes and nations could see and respect. Well, before we go any further, let's review lesson number 28, Israel's unbelief and God's deliverances and judgments. Question number 1, why didn't the 10 spies think Israel would be able to conquer Canaan? Because they saw the giants and the walled cities, and because they did not believe God's promise that he would give them the land. Why did Joshua and Caleb think that Israel could enter Canaan? Because they believed God's promises that he would give them the land. 3, what are we calling God if we do not believe his word and trust in him? We're calling God a liar. 4, will God accept anyone who does not believe what he says? No. All who do not believe God will go to everlasting punishment. 5, what was God's punishment on the Israelites because they did not believe his promise to give them the land? God said that all who did not believe him would die in the wilderness. They would not enter Canaan. 6, who did God say would enter into the promised land? Caleb and Joshua, because they had believed God, and the children of the Israelites, a new generation. 7, what should the Israelites have done when they needed water? Well, they should have trusted the Lord. And 8, why did the Lord say that Moses and Aaron would not enter the promised land? Because they did not trust and obey him, and therefore honor him as holy and perfect before the people. Instead, they showed their anger. We have Moses who struck the rock instead of speaking to it as God had instructed him. 9, what did the Lord do to punish the Israelites for their unbelief? The Lord sent poisonous snakes which bit and killed many of the people. 10, who like a snake has bitten all people and brought death into the world? Satan. 11, how did Satan bring death to all people? Satan led Adam and Eve to sin against God so that they and all of us would die. 12, what did God tell Moses to do to save the Israelites from death? The Lord told Moses to make a serpent out of grass and put it on a pole. 13, what did those who had been bitten by a snake have to do in order to be healed? They had to look at the snake on the pole. 14, did the snake of brass have magical power to heal those who looked? No. 15, who healed those who looked? It was the Lord who did it. 16, did they deserve to be healed? No, they were sinners and they deserved to die. And 17, why did the Lord heal everyone that looked? And the answer is because he is loving, merciful, and gracious. Because they believed his promise, they looked at the bronze serpent just as he had commanded. 18, did anyone who looked at the snake on the pole die? No, because God always does what he promises. Now we come to A, introduction. God showed his people his love and power as he led them through Moses to their promised land. He promised his people that if they obeyed his laws, that they would live a life of peace and would experience his blessing. Well, as the Israelites settled into the land that God had given them, he gave them leaders that they could go to if they needed help with any difficulties that they might have had. And these leaders would ask God for wisdom, and he would give the leader the right answer to the problem. Now we come to B. God's people demand a king. Whether God's people realized it or not, they already had a mighty king who ruled over them and kept them safe from their enemies. They could not see him, but he was never far from them because he spoke to them through his messengers. 1 Samuel 8, verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king over us to judge us like all the nations. But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Well, at this time in the Israelites' history, God's leader over his people was Samuel. And Samuel obeyed God, and he led his people faithfully. Because Samuel now was getting old, he allowed his 2 sons to be judges or leaders over the people in Israel. And Samuel was still the main leader. He was the last judge of Israel. And God's plan was to send a deliverer into the world. He chose the Jewish people to be his people. And from the Jewish people, the Savior would be born. It was important for all his people to be set apart and different than all the other nations who did not love or fear God. Is it any different today as believers? In many ways, we're so similar to the Israelites. When we believed in the Messiah, the Savior God promised to send, he set us apart from those around us who do not love or fear God. You see, God's purpose in setting us apart is so others can see his power and be drawn to his Son Jesus through our lives so they can be saved. We now come to C. God's people reject him as their sovereign ruler. And the theme here is that God is loving and merciful and gracious. Well, let's turn back to 1 Samuel 8. When Samuel heard the request of these men, his heart was broken. Samuel felt rejected when these men asked for an earthly king. And he went to the Lord and he poured out his heart to God. Let's look again at God's answer to Samuel in 1 Samuel 8, verse 7. The Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they've not rejected you, but they've rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they're doing the same to you. You see, these people weren't rejecting Samuel, they were rejecting their very own King of Kings. They had wicked, disbelieving hearts, and they wanted to be just like all the unbelieving people and nations that lived around them. In James chapter 4, verse 4, You adulterous peoples, don't you know that friendship with the world is hatred toward God? Anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Well, D, Samuel tells them what life will be like under a king. And the theme here is that man is a sinner. He needs God, and he's helpless to save himself. God told Samuel to warn them of what life would be like with an earthly king. He warned them about the downside of kings. In 1 Samuel 8, starting in verse 10. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He'll take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before the chariots. He'll appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of 50s, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He'll also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your seed and your vineyards and give them to his officers and his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and the best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He'll take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. And then you'll cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. Samuel obeys and tells the people what would happen to them when an earthly king ruled over them. And here's what Samuel told the Israelites would happen to them once they chose a man to be their king. He said their king would force all the young men to be in his army. He would force some of them to do his plowing and harvesting as well as making weapons for war and building chariots. This king would take their daughters to make perfume and do all of his household chores like cooking and baking. Their king would take the best fields and olive groves and vineyards in Israel and give them to his servants. Their king would take 1/10 of what they produced and give it to his servants. And finally, their new king would take the Israelites' male and female servants along with their strongest and finest young men to do his work, and he would take their donkeys as well. Well, as usual, the people don't listen, and in the end, they get what they ask for. The theme here is that God communicates with man, and God is everywhere all the time, and he knows everything. You see, God knew what would happen to his people when an earthly king ruled over them. These were not things that God as their king did to them, and he knew that one day they would realize the mistake they had made in asking for an earthly king. Here in the chronological timeline, let's look and notice that this occurred around 1000 BC. And Saul was followed by David, and then by his son Solomon, and then the rest of the kings. We come to E, Saul's coronation. God informs Samuel that a young man who is looking for his father's donkey will come to him for information. And when he does, Samuel is to anoint the man as king. Samuel gathers the people together and chooses a king by casting lots or by the roll of dice. 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1. There is a wealthy, influential man named Kish from the tribe of Benjamin. He was the son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Bechorath, son of Aphiah of the tribe of Benjamin. His son Saul was the most handsome man in Israel, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land. Theme: man always looks on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. The people were happy with the choice of Saul. He is described as tall and handsome, but looks can be deceiving. And the central theme in the book of Kings is that a person's value stems from inner qualities. After becoming king, Saul starts out well. He defeats most of Israel's enemies, but then things take a turn for the worse. Even before becoming king, Saul was a national hero. He led the daring raid to rescue the tablets of the Ten Commandments from the Philistines, who had captured them along with the ark. And after becoming king in his short 2.5-year reign, he freed the Jewish people of all their enemies except the Philistines. It remained for David to ultimately triumph over the Philistines and destroy them, but the army that Saul built laid the foundation for military victory. What we know is that Saul was charismatic and physically gifted, as well as extremely tall and handsome. He was charitable and selfless. Tradition records that he gave his fortune away to poor people. He specialized in helping pay for the needs of poor brides-to-be. When he went to war, he paid soldiers out of his own personal treasury, not out of public funds. And now we come to F. Saul takes matters into his own hand and disobeys God. The theme here is that man can come to God only according to God's will and plan. And the theme is God's timing is perfect. He's never late. He's always on time. Well, patience is a virtue. And in 1 Samuel 13, we read where Saul is about to engage their arch enemies, the Philistines, in battle. Samuel, Israel's last judge, he tells Saul to wait for him to return before offering a sacrifice. And Saul waits, but then he becomes nervous as he sees the troops growing restless. And feeling that he can't wait any longer, he offers the sacrifice himself. It's at that very moment that Samuel arrives, and Samuel is upset and deeply disturbed by what Saul has done. Let's read about this in 1 Samuel 13, verse 1. Saul was 30 years old when he became king and reigned for 42 years. Saul selected 3,000 special troops from the army of Israel and sent the rest of the men home. He took 2,000 of the chosen men with him to Michmash in the hill country of Bethel. The other 1,000 went with Saul's son Jonathan to Gibeah in the land of Benjamin. Soon after this, Jonathan attacked and defeated the garrison of Philistines at Gibeah. The news spread quickly among the Philistines, so Saul blew the shofar throughout the land, saying, "Hebrews, hear this, rise up in revolt." All of Israel heard the news that Saul had destroyed the Philistine garrison at Gibeah, and that the Philistines now hated the Israelites more than ever. So the entire Israelite army was summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. The Philistines mustered a mighty army of 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and as many warriors as the grains of sand on the seashore. And they camped at Michmash, east of Bethaven. The men of Israel saw what a tight spot they were in, and they became very hard pressed by the enemy. They tried to hide in caves and thickets and rocks and holes and cisterns. And some of them crossed the Jordan River and escaped into the land of Gad and Gilead. Meanwhile, Saul stayed at Gilgal, and his men were trembling with fear. Saul waited there 7 days for Samuel, as Samuel had instructed him earlier. But Samuel still didn't come. Saul realized that his troops were rapidly slipping away, so he demanded, "Bring me the burnt offering and the peace offerings." And Saul sacrificed the burnt offering himself. And just as Saul was finishing with the burnt offering, Samuel arrived. And Saul went out to meet him and welcome him. But Samuel said, "What is this you have done?" Saul replied, "I saw my men scattering from me, and you didn't arrive when you said you would, and the Philistines are at Michmash ready for battle. So I said, the Philistines are ready to march against us at Gilgal, and I haven't even asked for the Lord's help. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering myself before you came." "How foolish," Samuel exclaimed. "You've not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. Had you kept it, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom must end, for the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has already appointed him to be the leader of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command." Samuel then left Gilgal and went on his way, but the rest of the troops went with Saul to meet the army. They went up from Gilgal to Gibeah in the land of Benjamin. And when Saul counted the men who were still with him, he found only 600 were left. So not only did Saul overstep his boundary as king, because the sacrifice was supposed to be done by a priest, But the fear that precipitated the action demonstrates that he doesn't believe that God is the one who gives Israel its victories. As a result, Samuel tells Saul that his days as king are numbered. We come to G. Saul demonstrates how not to obey God. The theme here is that God is faithful. He never changes. The theme is that God communicates with man. Well, because the Amalekites had attacked the Israelites unprovoked during their wanderings in the wilderness under Moses, God commands the Israelites to attack and kill all the Amalekites, men, women, children, and even the livestock. Let's read what happens here in 1 Samuel 15, verse 1. One day Samuel said to Saul, "It was the Lord who told me to anoint you as king of his people Israel. Now listen to this message from the Lord. This is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. I have decided to settle accounts with the nation of Amalek for opposing Israel when they came from Egypt. Now go and completely destroy the entire Amalekite nation, men, women, children, babies, cattle, sheep, goats, camels, and donkeys." So Saul mobilized his army at Telaim, and there 200,000 soldiers from Israel and 10,000 men from Judah. Then Saul and his army went to a town of the Amalekites, and they lay in wait in the valley. Saul sent this warning to the Kenites: "Move away from where the Amalekites live, or you will die along with them. For you showed kindness to all the people of Israel when they came up from Egypt." So the Kenites packed up and left. Then Saul slaughtered the Amalekites from Havilah all the way to Shur, east of Egypt. He captured Agag, the Amalekite king, but completely destroyed everyone else. Saul and his men, they spared Agag's life and kept the best of the sheep and goats, the cattle, the fat calves and lambs, everything, in fact, that appealed to them. They destroyed only what was worthless or poor quality. And then the Lord said to Samuel, "I'm sorry that I ever made Saul king, for he's not been loyal to me, and he has refused to obey my command." And Samuel was so deeply moved when he heard this that he cried out to the Lord all night. Early the next morning, Samuel went to find Saul. Someone told him that Saul went to the town of Carmel to set up a monument to himself, and then he went on to Gilgal. When Samuel finally found him, Saul greeted him cheerfully. "May the Lord bless you," he said. "I've carried out the Lord's command." "Then what is all the bleating of sheep and goats and the lowing of cattle that I hear?" Samuel demanded. "Oh, it's true that the army spared the best of the sheep, goats, and cattle," Saul admitted, "but they're going to sacrifice them to the Lord your God. We've destroyed everything else." Notice that Saul says that they're going to sacrifice them to the Lord your God, like it's no longer his God. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Stop. Listen to what the Lord told me last night." "Well, what did he tell you?" Saul asked. And Samuel told him, "Although you may think little of yourself, are you not the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord has anointed you king of Israel. And the Lord sent you on a mission and told you, 'Go and completely destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, until they're all dead.' Why haven't you obeyed the Lord? Why did you do what was evil in the sight of the Lord?" "But I did obey the Lord," Saul insisted. "I carried out the mission that he gave me. I brought back King Agag, but I destroyed everyone else. Then my troops brought in the best of the sheep, goats, and cattle and plunder to sacrifice to the Lord your God in Gilgal." But Samuel replied, "What is more pleasing to the Lord, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to God's command? Obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering the fat of rams. Rebellion is as sinful as witchcraft, and stubbornness as bad as worshiping idols. So because you've rejected the command of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Then Saul admitted to Samuel, "Yes, I have sinned. I've disobeyed your instructions and the Lord's command, for I was afraid of the people and I did what they demanded. But now, please forgive my sin and come back with me so that I may worship the Lord." But Samuel replied, "I will not go back with you since you have rejected the Lord's command. He has rejected you as king of Israel." As Samuel turned to go, Saul tried to hold him back and tore the hem of his robe. And Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and he has given it to someone else, one who is better than you. And he who is the glory of Israel will not lie, nor will he change his mind, for he is not a human that he should change his mind." And then Saul pleaded again, "I know I've sinned, but please at least honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel by coming back with me, so that I may worship the Lord your God." So Samuel finally agreed and went back with him, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Israel attacks the Amalekites just as God ordered, and Israel is victorious, but Saul disobeys God by keeping the Amalekite king Agag alive, as well as some of the best livestock. And when Saul sees Samuel approaching after the battle, Saul exclaims, "Behold, I've done all that the Lord has commanded." Now, just for future reference, don't ever lie to a prophet of God. Samuel replies and says, "Then what is the bleating of sheep that I hear?" In response, Saul claims that the soldiers took the livestock, which is another lie, and besides, the animals are for sacrifice. At this point, Saul is told 3 lies to the man of God, and 3 lies and you're out. Neither God nor Samuel is happy with Saul's lies, pretense, and Samuel declares, "Does the Lord delight in burnt offering and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to give attention is better than the fat of rams." Well, consider this. Aren't we in some ways like Saul? I mean, we hate to throw things away, especially if they're still good and still work and have some value. There have been times when I wanted to save that which others considered to be garbage. In fact, one time I saw where my neighbor had put out a Keurig coffee maker out next to the garbage to be picked up as trash. I came home and told my wife and daughter that it was in the original carton and it looked like it had never been used. And they both looked at me like I was crazy and said, "Well, what are you waiting for? Go get it." So I got into my car, I drove across the street to the house on the corner and pulled alongside this Keurig in its original box, sitting there beside the curb, waiting to be picked up and hauled away as trash. I looked around because somehow I felt strange doing this, picking up someone else's trash. I brought the Keurig home, we inspected it. It was brand new, it had never been used. It even had the original warranty. That was about 3 or 4 years ago, and we've still been using it ever since. I can identify with someone like Saul who feels that something is too good to throw away or destroy. What troubles him is seeing perfectly good things destroyed. He had no trouble killing the Amalekite men and women, even their little children. He finds it difficult, however, to kill their king Agag, and he has no problem slaughtering all the marginal cattle, but he can't stand to throw away the prime USDA grade A beef and lamb. I think we may safely assume that Saul's sparing of Agag, along with his sparing of the best of the flocks and herds of the Amalekites, is really self-serving. I mean, Saul certainly gains a measure of popularity for allowing the Israelites to have a good sacrificial meal with the Amalekites' animals. After all, this not only means that they can feast on the meat, it also means that they don't have to sacrifice their own animals. So sparing the life of Agag probably provides Saul with a trophy and makes him even more popular with the people. When Agag sits at Saul's table, he is much like a stuffed moose head, mounted and prominently displayed in a hunter's den. Here's one more thing to consider. Remember in verse 22 when Samuel replies to Saul, "What is more pleasing to the Lord, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice?" Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering the fat of rams. I mean, that's a powerful statement, and it resonates today in so many ways. I could be stealing little bits of money from my company on a regular basis, small amounts which add up after a while, and God is telling me to repent and give the money back and make it right. But I don't want to do that because I've gotten used to the extra money in my bank account. But I'm still convicted that what I'm doing is wrong. So I decided to give extra money to charity as well as participate as chairman of my company's favorite charity to raise $500,000. And guess what? With my help and support, we raised almost $1 million to feed starving children in Africa. Now that ought to make God smile and wipe out my sin of stealing the little bits of money here and there from my company, right? Wrong. God says to me through the voice of Samuel that obedience is better than sacrifice and submission is better than offering the fat of rams or $1 million that's raised for charity. You see, that's not going to cut it with God. He wants me to deal with the main issue of obedience in my life on the one thing that he shined the spotlight on, and that's stealing. Nothing else will suffice. I can't substitute one thing for another. God says, stop stealing and make it right. Give the money back. To obey is better than sacrifice. Remember Abraham and Isaac? Abraham was told to offer up his son Isaac on the altar. Probably the hardest thing that parents have ever been asked to do. His only son, which he'd waited for so many years, and now he's being asked by God to kill Isaac as a sacrifice to God. Abraham is our example that to obey is better than sacrifice. God wanted Abraham's heart, and God did provide another sacrifice instead of Isaac. But Abraham went into this thing believing that even if he killed his son Isaac, God could raise him up and bring him back to life. And here's what we learn about Saul's disobedience. First, Saul's disobedience is committed by his partial obedience. Disobedience sometimes occurs in bold, blatant forms, such as Adam and Eve's disobedience regarding the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. But you see here, Saul sins by failing to obey God's commandment to the letter. Saul does most of what God tells him to do through Samuel, but he does not obey completely. Samuel sees this incomplete obedience as sin. And secondly, Saul's disobedience is religious in nature. Saul's disobedience is perceived and represented as obedience. I don't know how Saul justifies saving Agag's life, but it does not appear very religious to me. But you see, Saul is masterful at camouflaging his sin regarding the best of Amalekites' flocks. He says he and the people spared the best of the flocks to sacrifice to the Lord. Now, they may have indeed intended to do this, but their motivation is probably self-serving. The slaughter of all the cattle as God has commanded would be a sacrifice too, but the people will not be able to eat any of it. Sparing the animals as they do and then sacrificing them to God accomplishes at least two things. First, the people get a free meal at God's expense. They're able to share in the sacrificial meal. And second, they're able to sacrifice these cattle to God in place of their own, thus avoiding any real sacrifice on their part. The point is that Saul's disobedience has a pious veneer, but at its core, it's self-serving sin. Thus, Saul's actions are hypocritical, appearing to be pious when really they're pagan. And finally, 3, Saul's disobedience is not taken seriously enough by Saul. Saul is slow to accept responsibility for his sin as exposed by Samuel. Even when Saul confesses his sin, he lays some of the blame off on the people and then tries, too quickly for my liking, to move on to the blessings of God, hoping to sidestep divine discipline. This is especially apparent in verses 24 to 33. In a sense, Saul is saying something like, okay, all right, so I messed up. I admit it. Now, can we get on with my life? I want you to stay with me and worship with me so that my image is not tarnished before the people. In effect now, as in the sin of partial obedience, Saul is more concerned with the people's opinion of him than of God's estimation of him. Saul wants to put his sin behind him without hating it, without putting it away from him. And fourth, Saul's sin is hypocritical. If you remember, Saul is a man who will not tolerate anyone who fails to carry out his commands, even when they're foolish or detrimental. In chapter 14, Saul's son Jonathan inadvertently violates Saul's command not to eat anything until evening. Jonathan has not heard this command as he's been too busy fighting the Philistines. But Saul, his father, is determined to put him to death for disobedience and would have done so if the people had not refused to let it happen. Now, when it comes to Saul's obedience to the command of God, he's amazingly lenient on himself. Disobey God? Maybe. Disobey Saul? Never. And our theme is God demands obedience rather than religious acts or sacrifice. As Samuel turns to leave, Saul grabs his robe. He tears it. Samuel interprets this symbolically as God will tear Saul's kingship from him. Demonstrating that he still cares more about his own reputation than obeying God, Saul begs Samuel to stay and honor him before the people. Surprisingly, Samuel agrees, but first he must take care of some unfinished business. Summoning the Amalekite king, Samuel delivers some pre-death trash talk that would make even Brad Pitt blush. Just as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless among women. And then Samuel kills the Amalekite king with a sword. Although Saul has now lost God's favor and the backing of Samuel, he remains king for some time. But to borrow from expressions in the Bible, the writing is on the wall and his days are numbered. In our next lesson, number 30, we'll look at David the shepherd boy. Make a plan to join me again for lesson number 30. Until then, this is Pastor Dale saying, Shalom.